It's really super to see you all here this evening, and a very warm welcome also to those who are watching via Zoom. And this evening, it's a very special topic and a fresh one, which I'm delighted to note, and to introduce Till Breyer, who is going to speak on the Goethe, the French Revolution, and the figure of the political refugee, which is ever topical. And this will present a totally different and fresh insight. His focus will be on Goethe's epic poem, Hermann and Dorothea, 1797, to show how Goethe contributed to, but also ironically observed, the making of the political refugee. He is a lecturer in German studies at the University of Bochum. He held a Martin Miller and Hannah Norbert Miller visiting fellowship at the Center for German and Austrian Exile Studies here at the university in autumn 2024. And it's now my great pleasure to invite him to speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jana. And thank you all for being here. I hope everyone can hear me in Zoom, not...
Ja.
Okay. Das war deutlich. So, thank you all for being here, and thanks to the Research Center for German and Austrian Exile Studies, which was such a wonderful and nice and productive place for me to work in last year. And I'm glad to have the opportunity today to present some thoughts on a question I keep coming back to, and many scholars do in our context. And that is the question what it means, or better, what it meant in former times to say that someone is a refugee. So, introduction. In my talk, I will focus on a text by Goethe, which I believe gives us some fundamental insight into the specifically modern notion of the refugee. This modern notion of the refugee is what I refer to as the political refugee. Regarding this notion, I follow recent discussions by historians like Delphine Diaz, who showed that in the late 18th century, in the age of multiple revolutions in Europe and the Americas, the political refugee as a figure takes center stage. Before, the word refugee has predominantly referred to religious persecution, in which one religious community, often backed or represented by state actors, persecuted or expelled the members of another religious community. Those people, by contrast, who were more or less threatened by the French Revolution and who were consequently forced to leave the country, they were not persecuted with regard to their religion, of course, but for political reasons. And this changed the significance of the concept of exile itself. As historian Delphine Diaz writes, it is the beginning of a secularized history of exile. So, in the wake of this secularized history of exile, Goethe, among many others, wrote his oeuvre. Welcome. He wrote his oeuvre, and there are a couple of texts in which Goethe explicitly thematizes the refugees of the French Revolution. One of them is the collection of stories under the title Conversations Among German Emigrants, that some might know. It was published in 1795. And in these stories, we encounter a group of German refugees from the left bank of the Rhine who, as they travel, discover the importance of avoiding the social polarization with regard to the events in France. And I think it's very a topic that we can relate to somehow in the last years. In order not to fall apart as a group because of their different political opinions, they start to tell each other stories with only one rule: any political content has to be avoided. That's the Conversations of the German Emigrants. It is no secret that Goethe, like most of the German intellectuals of his time and social milieu, was not a supporter of the French Revolution. Indeed, as his letters show, Goethe was deeply skeptical about it, not only since the Terror started, but from the very beginning. Goethe feared that any form of social cohesion could fall apart if the political earthquake in the neighboring country could not at least be contained and kept out of the German territories. Now, while the conversations of German emigrants show us something like an inside perspective of a group of German refugees without any representative of a host community, the text I'm going to discuss today, the epic poem Hermann und Dorothea, shows us a group of exiles from the outside, so to say. So this is not only about social cohesion within the group of the refugees itself, but about the possibility, at least also about the possibility, of a social link or social bond between the exiles and a host community. This question of a social bond between refugee and host community will be at the center of my talk today. Right. So I come to my first or second chapter. Goethe wrote Hermann und Dorothea in 1796 and 1797 and published it in the same year in the Refugee Verlag. Seen from today, it's a somewhat strange or surprising text, especially because it is written in the ancient Greek metric form of the hexameter. That is to say, it is a long poem of sorts, over 130 pages in the original book publication, written in verse and subdivided in 9 cantos, Gesänge, each of which bears the name of one mythological muse. This makes sense, of course, in the context of so-called Weimar Classicism. With Hermann und Dorothea, Goethe set out to craft once more an oeuvre, like the Odyssey, an odyssey for modern times. And what could be more modern than the French Revolution? So, to give you an impression of the text, this is how it begins. And the translation is here. All the cantos have, as I said, the name of a muse and also a German word, name, or phrase that establishes a symbolic scheme for this chapter. The text begins with Calliope and Schicksal und Anteil, fate and sympathy, and goes like this. Truly, I never have seen the market and streets so deserted. How as if it were swept looks the town, or had perished. Not 50 are there, methinks, of all our inhabitants in it remaining. What will not curiosity do? Here is everyone running, hurrying to gaze on the sad procession of pitiful exiles. What we hear in this beginning of the epic poem is the voice of the host of the Golden Lion. In the course of the text, the narrator's voice will switch back and forth between the characters. In the village, there's the host's wife, then an apothecary, a pastor, and Hermann, the host and his wife's son, whom his father wants to find a girl to marry soon. So the text establishes a social space in which the voices of different people, of people with different attitudes and opinions, can be heard. But this social space is uniform in 2 ways at least. First, all of them, or almost all of them, are citizens of a small town and represent a bourgeois profession like apothecary or pastor. And secondly, and obviously, they all speak in hexameters. I think one thing this epic poem sets out to explore is the condition under which something like social forms or social rhythms can be maintained in times of crisis. You may have noticed that the very beginning of the text focuses on a specifically social feeling, that is, on the feeling of pity. Hermann's father and his wife, they are the only ones who have stayed behind because, as he says later on, he doesn't want to see the hardships of the refugees with his own eyes. He has enough, like, from the other people coming back and telling him about it. Almost everyone else has left. A few decades earlier, the playwright Gotthold Ephraim Lessing has defined the feeling of pity mitleid, as the most humane feeling of all. In one of his aesthetic writings, Lessing famously states, the most pitying or the most compassionate man is the best man. Der mitleidigste Mensch ist der beste Mensch. And around the same time, Adam Smith has equally discovered pity, or as he names it, sympathy, as the basic feeling of all humanity and the fundamental principle of social cohesion. However, the picture that Goethe gives us here seems to have a significant crack. Everyone is running and hurrying as if they were afraid to miss something out. Their compassion is closely aligned with Neugier, curiosity. And it seems they want to gaze rather than help. The town is deserted, as the narrator says, is deserted or swept. The arrival of the refugees is literally a blockbuster. I think it's important to note that from the beginning, the text problematizes what the Enlightenment philosophers called social bond or social tie. In other words, the principles that enable social connection and cohesion. This motive of the social bond comes up a couple of times in the text. For example, when Dorothea describes the French Revolution as follows. Dorothea says, all the bonds or all the ties of the world have been loosened, and what shall mend them but misery or but need alone? Gelöst sind die Bande der Welt, wer knüpft sie wieder, als allein nur die Not? Yes. Goethe's text seems to imply that pity might not be enough to repair the loosed social ties. So how do the characters in the epic poem actually come together? This is a good moment to give you a brief overview or reminder regarding the plot. So, the host and his wife are in fact waiting for their son Hermann to return home, whom they have sent to distribute clothes, linen, and food among the refugees. At first, the pastor and the apothecary return from the refugee spectacle and describe with horror the chaos and disorder they have seen. When Hermann returns, he tells his parents and their friends about a girl he has met and with whom he seems to have fallen in love. This entails a conflict in which the father underlines the importance of finding a spouse that is well off and not poor, like a refugee. The two friends, the apothecary and the pastor, then offer to undertake an investigation into the reputation of the girl, with the help of Hermann's detailed description of what she looks like. And this is a very I think this is a very important theme because Hermann describes her in detail, like what she wears and what her hair looks like and so on. And when they finally find Dorothea among the refugees, they repeat this detailed description word by word. So this is really a scheme to identify someone. I will come back to that. In the refugee camp, the apothecary and the pastor split up. The pastor talking to someone called the judge, while the apothecary tries to find the girl. The judge then, and this is a little episode, the judge tells the pastor all about the causes of their flight and tells that at first, everyone in their hometown was enthusiastic about the revolution and also about the French invaders, until these invaders became oppressors who were finally expelled by German troops. And so this is a complex situation. It's not like, first, it's not French refugees. Sometimes, like in superficial summaries of the plot, you find this wrong summary that it's French refugees coming to Germany. It's German refugees from the left bank of the Rhine. And they come because they are refugees that have to go because the French have become refugees themselves. So this is very interesting. The French came, but they are expelled by the German troops. And these refugees then kind of set into motion the Germans that live in this area that become refugees of the second order. So this is a very interesting mechanics that happens. In the turmoil of the war, They themselves, the Germans on the left bank of the Rhine, were uprooted and had to seek shelter in the neighboring Pfalz, the Palatinate. But it's also very important that the judge tells the pastor about a maid among the refugees that has proven particularly courageous, especially when she defended a group of girls against French soldiers who wanted to rape them. So she defended them with a sword in her hand. Meanwhile, the apothecary, in turn, has spotted a girl who is busy sewing clothes for these little children out of donated cotton. And it turns out that this is the same girl the judge has been talking about. And this is, of course, Dorothea, with whom Hermann has fallen in love. Yeah. So the apothecary and the pastor have successfully proven two inner qualities of Dorothea. That is her courage and her altruism. This is like an important point. I wrap it up a little bit from here. Hermann, being shy, asks Dorothea to become the maidservant of his parents' house, to which she agrees. At home, there's this last little drama and misunderstanding when Hermann's father, who thinks that his son has already proposed to Dorothea, ironically says something like, "Are you sure you want to marry my son?" or so. And she feels insulted because she's saying, "I'm here to work." So she feels treated disrespectfully. But the wise pastor pours oil on troubled water and indirectly makes Dorothea admit that she too fell in love with Hermann, and so everything's a happy ending. Although there are still obvious signs within the text that the threat of political instability is ongoing. So it's a problematic idyll. It's something like an idyll on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's a very endangered idyllic scene. The last lines of the text go like this. Hermann speaks them. With some of the last lines, not the last lines. So much the firmer then, amid these universal convulsions, be Dorothea our union. We too will hold fast and continue, firmly maintaining ourselves and the right to our ample possessions. For that man who, when times are uncertain, is faltering in spirit, only increases the evil and further transmits it. I want to highlight two aspects. First, we have a semantic opposition between transmitting and interrupting a movement of crisis. There is an implicit mechanical model of social upheaval all over the text. I alluded to it a minute ago. A mechanical model according to which refugees are seen as physical bodies thrown out of a certain space and transmitting their centrifugal force. This is why integration becomes a delicate and somehow dangerous operation. Like you don't want to continue this force on and on. Second, the social order that has to be preserved here consists in a certain bourgeois form of life in which possessions and wealth play a key role. And it seems that Dorothea has turned out to be a proper and fitting recruitment for this form of life, a fact which becomes clear only after a certain hermeneutics of character, during which Dorothea is enabled to stand out against the chaotic background of her fellow refugees. These refugees and their chaotic procession are described earlier in the text as follows. We'll talk a little bit more about these refugees in the background now. And you have only the English version here because I didn't want to put too much text on the slide. So, during the first part of the epic poem, the refugees are described as follows. Panting 'neath baskets and tubs, full of things of no manner of value, all confused and disordered. The one whose beasts were the weaker wanted more slowly to drive, while faster would hurry another. Pressed at last from the rut and out to the edge of the highway, slipped the creaking wheel, the cart lost its balance, and over fell in the ditch. So lay the cart, all broken to fragments, and helpless the people. Keeping their onward way, the others drove hastily by them, each thinking only of self, and carried away by the current. It is important to notice that here and in several other instances, the refugees are represented as a non-society. First, they transport goods without value. That means they don't follow the basic rules of political economy. And in the same direction goes this, they lose their balance, if you take balance as an economic notion of the time. Secondly, they don't follow a common rhythm and speed, different from the epic poem itself. And lastly, the refugees are compelled to think only of themselves. We might say they are a beehive of egoists, only without an invisible hand. Later in the text, there is a moment when the judge says, this here, when the judge says, but no law the fugitive knows, save of self-preservation, and with a reckless greed consumes all the possessions about him. We can see that Dorothea as a character is being silhouetted against the backdrop of complete disintegration. The refugees appear not as a body politic, but as politic enemy, like enemy as social disintegration. The Goethe scholar Karl Eibel correctly interpreted this as a state of nature in the Hobbesian sense. Dorothea, in turn, does not represent this state of nature, but constitutes a noble exception. And I think this aspect of Dorothea's inner or hidden nobility is crucial, and I will come back to it in a minute. At any rate, it is significant that Hermann, a little bit earlier, tries to advertise that girl that his father doesn't know yet by saying, well, father, don't you know that within these refugee groups, there are a lot of like princesses and aristocrats hidden within the refugees. So like, we should give it a try, right? I think that Hermann und Dorothea, which is often interpreted as a love story about openness, recognition, and integration, poses the problem of forced migration in a completely new and modern way that is closely linked to the entry of the political refugee into the public sphere. I will further clarify what I mean by undertaking a short philological excursion with regard to one of the most important sources of Goethe's epic poem, which is an anecdote from the year 1734. It has long been known that in Goethe scholarship, and you might know it too already, that the plot of Hermann und Dorothea is based on an anecdote that Goethe mentions in his letters. This anecdote is set in the year 1731 in Bavaria, in the context of the emigration of the so-called Salzburger Exulanten, the Salzburg exiles, who had been expelled by the Catholic Bishop of Salzburg and who at the time became one of the most famous migration movements in Europe. Like, there were a lot of books in which their story was told. The anecdote is printed in this chronicle, ja, vollkommene Emigrationsgeschichte von denen aus dem Erzbistum Salzburg, and so on and so on. It's printed inside this chronicle, and here it is. It takes a long time to find it because it's 800 pages, but they are found in the end. In this chronicle by Gerhard Göcking from 1734. And it tells the story of a young refugee maid from Salzburg who espouses the son of a rich farmer somewhere in Bavaria. And the story goes almost exactly like in Hermann und Dorothea. The father had waited for his son to marry for a long time. And he meets a girl among the refugees, asks his father, who hesitates because of her precarious situation, but finally agrees to have the girl invited at his house. In this anecdote, too, the girl is the only one who doesn't know about the marriage plan and who feels insulted. Like in the German text, she says something like, ihr wollt mich wohl foppen. Like, I came across this old word, foppen, once more. Beautiful. She doesn't know about it, and so she feels insulted, but then sure after she accepts the proposal and so on. Goethe stayed quite close to this plot, but there are significant changes. One of them, you see here the title Wunderbare Heirat. There are significant changes. One of them consists in the investigation of the pastor and the apothecary regarding the identity and reputation of Dorothea. Another difference regards Dorothea's dramatic achievement of defending other girls with a sword in her hand. These differences relate to one of the central issues of Hermann and Dorothea, namely the peculiarity of Dorothea against the background of the chaotic and selfish nature of the other refugees. It is indeed interesting to note that the point of the original anecdote is quite different. It is not about peculiarity, but quite on the contrary, about an exemplary and representative story in which we are invited to grasp something like the divine nature of the Salzburg emigration itself. We can see that especially with regard to the narrative frame, that is to say, the beginning and the ending of the anecdote, which goes like this. I read my personal English translation might not be 100% correct. The miraculous guidance of God could be perceived with regard to a Salzburgian maid, that's the beginning of this anecdote, who had to leave father and mother for religious reasons, and who was prodigiously married during her journey. And then comes the whole anecdote, and then the ending goes like this. Isn't this reason enough to cry out with amazement, Lord, your decisions are beyond comprehension, and your ways beyond understanding? So the short anecdote that struck Goethe so much is about a betrothal that is also a symbol for the wisdom of God. That is to say, for the bond between God and the faithful community of the Salzburg Protestants. The girl from Salzburg Chronicle does not stand out against, but for the religious community as a whole. I hope I put this correctly. So she doesn't it's not her background against which she takes shape, but she represents it. The fate of the emigrants as a whole reflects itself in the miniature story of the prodigious marriage. Okay. Second, the same is true for the relation between refugees and host society. As a religious community, the migrants and the natives or locals are not seen as separate from each other. Rather, they already belong to the same community because they share one and the same confession. I would even go so far as to say, compared to the refugees in Goethe's epic poem, the religious refugees of the Salzburg Chronicle always already reside within the cultural space of their possible hosts. The Prussian king, Frederick Wilhelm I, who quickly published a decree to invite the Salzburg exiles to Prussia, was not seen as the leader of a foreign country, but as the representative of the same God that the refugees already believed in. And the openness and friendliness of Prussia was the mundane reflection of the kingdom of heaven. We can see all this from a wonderful contemporary illustration, which semantically crossfades God, King, and the concept of the Father in general. So I just translate have translated the little German poem at the bottom of the picture. Although I have to leave house and farm, friends, parents, children, the Lord nonetheless will take me into his arms. He holds me fatherly on his right hand and leads me cheerily into Frederick William's land. The horizontal movement from Salzburg to Königsberg that is represented in the picture does not seem to cross an essential cultural border or transit a state of nature. So in the following slides, I tried to visualize this difference between the spatial logics of the anecdote and the spatial logics of Hermann and Dorothea, and thereby implicitly using the concept of literary space as it has been developed by Yuri Lothman. So, as I already mentioned, my claim is that the Salzburg refugees are not really separated from their host communities, at least with regard to the implicit conception of space within the chronicle in which the anecdote was published. Rather, the king stands for God as well as for the father that the refugee might have left at home. Consequently, at the time, the whole migratory movement could be represented and interpreted as a movement that never really leaves the space that actually matters. That is to say, the common space of Protestant faith. By contrast, in the 1790s, the situation has changed in obviously a very reductive sketch of this literary space. The situation has changed. The ordered space of the village in which everyone has his or her stable identity and function is sharply opposed to the disordered space of the refugee camp. Seen in the light of this difference, it makes sense that the refugees movement doesn't even lead into the village, but somewhere else. It's more like a tangent that leads into the void. The main question is, what kind of relation, you represent this question like this, what kind of relation can be established between the village and the people on the move? And my point is just to make that clear, that the fact that this question exists makes it modern. Like, this is a modern problem. As we have seen, all the principles of enlightened social engineering, like the feeling of pity, or the principles of political economy, fail with regard to the refugee camp. Also, there seems to be no common denominator between the refugees and the village community. In his essay, Anomaly and Danger, the scholar Joel Landy has underlined the precarious figure of the multitude, the Menge, that seems to endanger the community, but at the same time implies the potential of social change. In fact, Goethe's poem represents the refugees as an ungovernable multitude, as ungovernable as the French revolutionary people. I think that's why the betrothal between Hermann and Dorothea depends on the revelation of some kind of nobility regarding Dorothea. Only as a character of inner nobility, as a crypto-aristocrat, so to say, can Dorothea stand out against the multitude and be integrated into the political community. As Yuri Lotman might have said, Dorothea crosses the border between the space of disorder and the space of the ordered bourgeois community. But we might add, after what I have said, she can do so only because she didn't really belong to the realm of the refugees in the first place. This would at least be one possible conclusion. I think that the long history of illustrations that Hermann and Dorothea has sparked reflects the way in which Dorothea is narratively privileged. This is a good moment to have a look at this little title picture that I gave you already in the announcement. It's from the year 1888 and made by the painter Arthur von Ramberg. And we see here that Dorothea is the only figure among the refugees who is seen as a whole, complete figure. And I think the way she holds the crook, quite interesting. I don't know if someone knows something about this, like how do you hold this kind of crook at the time when you guide these kind of cattle. But I find it interesting because she holds it somehow like a pen or like a writing instrument, maybe even like a paintbrush. And I think that might allude to her subject position as a sovereign actor who is, even in times of crisis, the author of her own life. Okay. Just to summarize, between the Refugee Chronicle from the year 1734, which Goethe uses for his plot, and Goethe's epic poem about political refugees, the whole question of refugee reception seems to have changed. The old religious question might have sounded like this, and I have to have made up these questions now, might have sounded like this. The early modern question: how can we discern the will and the ways of God in the hardships and coincidences of actual exile experience? And the modern question, by contrast, goes more like this: does the refugee embody the qualities necessary to establish a social bond or social tie between him and his host community. My claim is that this second question stands behind the narrative examination in which the inner qualities of Dorothea have to be proven. By the way, I think this can be put into a very concrete historical context, given the fact that the years after 1792 saw early forms of border control and bureaucratic identification procedures, not only in France, but also in the German territories. And this is a very interesting chapter in the history of German state formation. The historian Gérard Noiriel has pointed out that the French Revolution was the hour of birth of a new centralized regime of identification and state citizenship. In fact, German territories from Prussia to Bavaria started to pass bills from 1792 onwards. And these, so they started to pass these immigration bills and decrees, which put into place measures of control and expulsion vis-à-vis the French refugees. And these bills and measures, they became more and more like repressive and unwelcoming from the year 1796 onwards. But apart from this concrete historical background, Hermann und Dorothea indicates a new secularized problematic of the modern refugee, which is hermeneutic in nature. Divine providence and religious community are substituted by a certain hermeneutics of the refugee subject. Who is he or she? What are his or her qualities, abilities, and political convictions? This new or modern perspective necessarily follows a binary logic. Some should be integrated and some should not. I think that the Goethe scholar Charlton Payne is right when he states in his essay Epic World Citizenship that the epic representation of a rounded or deep character in Hermann und Dorothea depends on the marginalization of the social surroundings of this character. So like this obvious, not a paradox, but it's a equilibrium maybe, is quite important. So you have like one character that is rounded, that is given this space in the literary representation, and around her or him you have these more superficial representations of all the rest. So the social bond of modern nation-state citizenship is exclusive in character. Since the French Revolution, it has become impossible to compose a chronicle. I think it's impossible to compose a chronicle of a migration movement in which every minor individual story metonymically stands in for the whole, and vice versa. Rather, since the French Revolution, the individual aptitude of social and political belonging has to be examined and has to be proven. For the last chapter of this talk, I would like to draw a wider and slightly speculative line from Goethe to the 20th century. So I just leave Goethe for once, but we find him again in the 20th century. Come to my last chapter. So when I wrote this presentation, I asked myself, how did the problematic relation between the refugee and the realm of the community change in the context of the Exile novel of the 1930s and early 1940s? In other words, how is the question whether a refugee embodies the potential for social and political integration, for a political and social bond, processed in exile literature? And of course, I asked this question because I had one text in mind, and this is Transit by Anna Segers. This novel can be read as a story of political conversion in which a refugee narrator, who at first floats around in Marseille without a specific purpose, eventually discovers his own political position or vocation, that is, to stay in South France and resist the National Socialist threat rather than fleeing from it. So, exile or resistance? This is the question for Transit. Seen in this slide, one of the political enigmas of this novel becomes a bit more clear. namely the fact that Segas's narrator depicts the other emigrants, especially when they turn up in large groups, in a quite pejorative manner. And there are many commentators on this novel who I think they didn't quite know what to do of that. Like some wrote, well, you can write this only if you're a refugee yourself, or like some excuses for this very almost hostile way to depict the other refugees around her that are like in Marseille. They are described as swarms, hives, bunch of refugees. The narrator says the embassies are crawling with refugees who are depicted as somewhat hysterical or passive. Once he says the refugees are always waiting for nothing in a whirl of fear, something like that. Existentialist undercuts. And on top of that, minor refugee figures in the novel are frequently portrayed as somehow already dead. This is a very important motive in the novel. Like it looks like a skeleton, the face, bones, and so on. So the Segas scholar, Eckhard Rolls, has rightly pointed out the following. The author equates leaving one's homeland with death, no matter if one dies on the voyage or not. Her simple formula is emigration equals death. Only political refugees, as herself, are excluded from this equation. This constitutes a very simplistic view of the complex problem of emigration. So what we see when we look at the narrative structure of a novel like Transit, we can discern an implicit opposition between mere emigrants or expelled people on the one hand, that is to say, people who are dispersed across the countries passively, like physical bodies who infinitely transmit the movement of expulsion. And on the other hand, you have what you could call political refugees in a more emphatic sense of the word, who, like the narrator in Segas' novel, eventually adopts a specific political identity, that is to say, establishes a social bond and finds his place within a political community, which he does at the end of the novel. It's a village, by the way. He really goes into a village from Marseille to this orange farm. It's not even a... So, of course, this community for Segas is not a national community. It's a community of anti-fascists. This topic, the perceived or construed distinction or opposition between mere emigrants and political refugees, touches upon a deep-seated problem of post-war exile studies themselves. I think this is a very, very interesting aspect that Dorothea Bischoff has shown and discussed, among others. In her article Exilanten oder Emigranten from the year 2013, she writes that the problem has been that for a long time, the figure of the political exile has been foregrounded as someone who was an active anti-fascist and who at the same time held fast to his or her identification with Germany. And this has been a very important point. Thereby, the so-called exile or political refugee in an emphatic sense could later be interpreted as representing a proper and better history of Germany in exile. By contrast, the mere emigrant was frequently seen as a passive refugee. And on top of that, if they were Jewish, they could be seen as persons who had only weak ties to the German nation anyway. So, as Dorothea Bischoff writes, by emphatically referring to political exiles as banished, Verbannte, some exile scholars give them the nimbus of a special victim status, while at the same time they are attributed a potential for political opposition and agency. By contrast, or in contrast, the Jews who emigrated due to the racially motivated expulsion are referred to as emigrants. So, like this, obviously not an like exhausting discussion of the possible content of these two words, but like there's a latent dichotomy in the field that Dorothea Bischoff and others have commented on in this way. So it might well be that the distinction between Dorothea and the chaotic non-society of her fellow refugees, between a foregrounded individual and the masses in the background, between political action and the mere transmission of a movement, recurs in the novels of the exile period as well as in exile scholarship. To be sure, the meaning of social belonging changes. It can imply national belonging, but also some form of political belonging, as in Seeger's Transit. But the most surprising example, and this will be my last little chapter in this talk, the most surprising example for the enduring relevance of Goethe's epic poem that I found is a novel which was written in 1938 in Mexico and which wasn't published until 1984, 41 years after its author's death. And I'm very happy that I read yet another article by my colleague Dorothea, because otherwise I wouldn't have known that this novel contains this aspect. And the novel is, I will I will describe it in a minute what I mean. And the novel is this one, Der Umbruch oder Hannah und die Freiheit, by German Jewish author Alice Rühle-Gerst. And in this novel, Goethe's epic poem plays a role and is even quoted at considerable length. And the story goes like this. The novel is about a protagonist called Hannah, a young communist from Germany, born in Prague, but lives in Germany, who is politically persecuted by the Nazis and who leaves Germany across the green border to Czechoslovakia. In Prague, she starts to work undercover for a liberal bourgeois newspaper in which she secretly plans minor pieces of communist propaganda. Eventually, Hannah and some of her friends lose their confidence in the Central Committee when the Stalinist atrocities and also the nationalist turn of the Soviet Union become evident. Anyway, a comrade of hers named Kurt keeps smuggling communist propaganda material across the border back into Germany to instruct the working class. And one of these materials, a pamphlet by Soviet politician Dimitrov, is hidden inside an inconspicuous booklet. And this booklet is Goethe's Hermann und Dorothea. So because the whole middle part of the epic poem has been replaced by the Soviet pamphlet, Hannah can only read the first and the last page of it. And both are quoted at length in the novel, with some omissions. And I quote from the novel's texts again with some omissions. And I know it's very long, but it's the last quote. So, Kurt was still a devout and steadfast communist and still brought literature over to Germany illegally once or twice a month, at the greatest risk to his life. Innocent reclam booklets with the names Goethe and Schiller emblazoned on the covers. Blah, blah, blah. And if you turn to the last page, it said, for the man who is of a wavering disposition in a wavering time, he increases the evil and spreads it further and further. But he who firmly perseveres in his mind forms the world for himself. And if everyone thought like me, power would stand up against power, and we would all enjoy peace. These are the last words of the epic poem, actually. How beautiful, how true, thought Anna. In wavering times, waveringly minded. But if you turned the pages in the middle, you would find parts of the Dimitrov speech scattered in tiny print between the epic pages. Oh, what kind of stuff they are bringing to Germany, the boys with the ignorant, convinced faces. As if the Dimitrov speech were suitable for promoting the rising power against power. As if it did not rather deepen the powerlessness of the already powerless. No, the simple, brave Louise, yet another character, the simple, brave Louise had not gone through with it. She had left the party and, of course, had also left her insistent friend behind. And this word insistent in German is like der beharrenden Freund. This is again a quote from the last line of the epic poem, like very ironic. This intertextual encounter of a fictional exile communist with Goethe's epic poem could, at first glance, be read as some kind of homage or encouragement. How beautiful, how true. But as it happens, there are multiple ironic cracks in the picture. Concealing a communist pamphlet between Goethe's hexameter lines is in itself somewhat funny, but implicitly underlines it also implicitly underlines the nationalist undertones of Goethe's text itself. At the same time, the narrator implies that Kurt, the communist comrade, might see himself as some sort of modern Hermann who resists the German threat. Now, it is important to note that the narrator herself distances herself from either side, from the Nazis, of course, but also from the communist boys who think that they participate in a heroic communist resistance, while in fact, they fail to question their adherence to a political regime that doesn't liberate but deepen the situation of the powerless, at least according to the perspective of the narrator. I'm coming to an end now. The novel Der Umbruch is indeed different from a novel like Transit, in that it does not tell a story of political conversion or stable political identity. In the latter part of the novel, Der Umbruch, its protagonist, disappointed by her political party, abandons it and leaves her political environment altogether. This is the point when, by coincidence, the Czechoslovakian government orders her to leave the country, expulsion. The novel ends with Hannah crossing the border to Austria afoot. She doesn't know yet where she's heading, maybe to Spain. On her way, she meets an Austrian worker, a comrade, placeless like her, and they meet like on the border, and the comrade goes into the other direction, goes in the direction of Czechoslovakia. There's a short conversation. So the novel somehow inverts the movement of Goethe's epic poem. It leads the protagonist from a stable political identity to a precarious state of non-belonging and into a no man's land between two countries. It's as if we would read Hermann and Dorothea from the end to the beginning. Hence, on the last pages, all social bonds have fallen apart or loosened, as Dorothea would have put it. I think that by ending in this particular way, the novel indicates that in the face of Stalinism, the foundation of a political community has to start from zero. Thank you very much for your attention and your patience.
Till, thank you very much indeed for that. I found it fascinating to trace from 1700s through to today in such a short space of time, and yet with so many references that are still pertinent today. And when you mentioned right at the start the people rushing to view the refugees, one of my interviews described how people came out to the street and spat on the refugees being taken into internment on the Isle of Man. And they were actually having to walk from the railway station to the port. And people thought they were all German, and therefore an enemy. And of course, it was not the case. But also your point about refugees and their political backgrounds, and the fact that when they came to Britain from Europe, either just before World War II or afterwards, they brought with them their own political views, their prejudices, their preferences, and didn't necessarily change them. So it's such a fascinating topic. And what Goethe wrote all those years ago about attitudes to refugees, and one might say even today, plus ça change. So, thank you very much indeed. I really enjoyed that, and I thought it was very thought-provoking too, and the comparisons. May I now invite questions from people here in the university itself, but also those who are viewing via Zoom. Are there any questions in the box at all, please, too? And then I'll come back to you, Tony.
I'm not sure if there's already, so maybe we could start.
But we'll start with Tony. Please go ahead.
Well, this is just a, a question arising from my own reading. I was thinking in terms of texts, German text, that deal with the internal displacement. I mean, this is a very particular feature, that you've got an internal displacement. And in particular, the very interesting remarks he made about the perception of refugees on the one hand, and a stable, coherent, cohesive society on the other. I was thinking of a wonderful novel by Walter Kempowski, Alles umsonst, All for Nothing, which depicts the displacement of masses of East Prussians in face of the advance of the Red Army. And one of the peculiarities of the novel is that the Red Army, the Russians killed hardly anybody. I think there's one character who was killed by a bomb dropped by a Russian plane. The rest, the Germans managed to kill them, commit suicide, etc. By the end, only the main character, who's I think thinly disguised version of the young Kempowski himself, survives, and a particularly unpleasant Nazi who actually gives up his place on a ship, which rescues the boy, takes him presumably, I don't know, to Danzig or somewhere. It is, I think, it in a way is a reverse, because the stable community that seems to exist is in fact based on falsehood, because it relies on coercion and a murderous ideology amongst those displaced are people who've been liberated from prisons and camps. So that is a big difference. But otherwise, I'm sort of discovering parallels, and at the same time trying to say how extremely enjoyable I found Kempowski's novel. Is available in translation.
Thank you. I never read the novel. I didn't know, but I will now after you mentioned it. I think the comparison with these the German Vertriebene after the war that you refer to, right? This is particularly interesting, exactly because of what you said, that the host community is not a well-ordered society and hasn't been for a long time. And secondly, there is this national, ethnic or national relation between the expelled and the people in Germany, right? So this is there's a national bond, and I couldn't explain how this played out, but this is a whole different situation compared to refugee reception situations where the refugees do not have this language or national bond with the whole society, right? Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Any other comments or contributions, please?
Those words to been young tools against the parents for religious reasons, and then there's just in marriage. Can you tell me any more about?
About the anecdote?
Yeah.
I only have the text.
What's the backstory? Yes. What's the backstory? Sorry.
Okay. I don't know exactly what you mean, the Salzburg exile backstory, or of this girl in particular?
Young girl who leaves her parents.
Yeah. Right. So I don't know a lot about her, because like she exists only in this brief text of 30 lines in this chronicle, and she is only called a maid or a girl, and she's part of these refugees from Salzburg, yeah, and they have been expelled because by the Catholic bishop. Hermann, I think was his name, and he had like this eviction patent, and they had to go. And there was really an outcry in the Protestants, even non-Protestant communities in Europe, Like this seemed to many people, it seemed particularly cruel. And the interesting thing is that she is not what my colleague Charlton Bain would maybe have that I mentioned briefly would have called a rounded figure. She's really just a maid. Like she has no particular identity, and this is also what I meant when I said she stands for the whole community, right? That is on the move. It's not really about her, and this is the big difference to Dorothea. And I just wondered, like, how did Goethe, process this material and make Dorothea a very rich and relatively complex character out of her, who we don't even know. As I said, her age, her name is all not known. Yeah. But she probably, I don't know. I mean, I like to think that she existed, but I mean, this is a partly religious text, right? So this is about divine providence more than about documentation.
Were these people that were expelled Protestants?
Yes.
And that's why they were expelled.
Yes.
Okay, you didn't say that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm right.
And
The
that's
basic informations are missing.
received them because
Exactly. I should have said a few more sentences about it. I should have said a few more sentences about it.
Had limited time.
But but exactly, like Salzburg was like there were Protestant and Catholic parts in the population, but the bishop, who's also the fürst, he's also the duke or the fürst, yeah. He can, according to the treaties after the 30 Years' War, he can like evict them. Right. This formula. So if you're like the governing the territory, you can decide which religion is dominant. So, and it's exactly as you said, Friedrich Wilhelm, King Friedrich Wilhelm of Prussia, he is Protestant too. So he invited them. Yeah.
What struck me about the image that you showed was that he's an outsized figure, and the refugees were very small by comparison, and pleading.
Yeah, and you really have this triangle space here. So
Yes,
here you have Jehovah, I think, and then you're a king, and here the text is about the father that she left, but also the fatherly welcome by the king.
the father figure.
Fatherly, exactly. So this was way before the Oedipus complex, I'd say, yeah. Okay.
do we actually know what made the Prussian king so magnanimous and welcoming? May not have been all that kind of
Yeah.
characteristic. He must have had a motive.
Exactly. Exactly, he had. So the first, I'm not like an expert for this epoch or for this very chapter, but I can say one thing is that it suits you well to do it if you're a Protestant king with the with the basic idea to lead your religious community and to be responsible for them. And second, more concrete reason, there were large parts in Brandenburg, but also around Königsberg, that were not well populated. Even the Black Death, like some not too long before. And this was a third and last reason. You have this populationist thought at the time in political economy. So the more people you have in your land, the richer this land is. Like more taxes, more production, more professions. So exactly. So this is not only about altruism, but yeah. And also just one remark, interesting, like he already knew how to do it because he was welcoming the Huguenots 3 decades earlier. and the Huguenot, and he did very like this already played out a very good decision economically. Yeah.
But Protestant groups have been expelled before. That was the first time, not the last.
Like the Huguenots from France.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, did the Prussian king only appear once in I mean, he had taken in the French Huguenots, but where did the other groups go?
To a couple of countries, England, the Netherlands, I think Switzerland already at the time. I'm not completely sure.
It was possible.
Like Helvetia. And I think I missed an important destination, but there were like a couple of mainly Protestant territories that welcomed them. I mean, Stefan, you can probably say more about it, but I don't want to force you.
Oh, could we have this question?
What was Goethe's experience with immigration?
Let me think. I can't think any. Yet, like there's a famous story that one like youth when he was young, there's what a kind of youth love in his life, and this was I can't tell much more about her, but this was a Huguenot girl that he fell in love with when he was young. Like this is a very bad biographical note. But Till wanted to say something, but I can't think of anything in the narrow sense of.
He encounters refugees as part of his, when he goes on campaign in 1792 on witnesses after Valley in the Exile. His account of that, which was writes much later, he includes precisely this sort of these chaotic scenes with refugees, sort of filling the streets and adding to the chaos rather than and so on. So, that's not his.
Also bringing more chaos back to Prague.
Seeing rather than being.
Yeah. Right. He encounters refugees, and he also experiences. I think you could say that experiences how like the emigrant armies bring the chaos like back to France with the trying to invade. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
So there's a question online.
Ben, please, could we have your question? Welcome.
Yes, hello. I just wanted to add one little correction, and that is that the town that Dorothea's or Hermann's family is from, it is not a village. It's a city. It's called a Stadt. It's obviously not a huge city, and it may not make much difference, especially because the family is portrayed as what was called then an Ackerbürger family. So they were Bürger, but they had some agriculture outside the city gates. That's represented by this door that they had through the city wall, that by special permission of the authorities. So their agriculture is basically wine growing, a vineyard for all we know. But in any case, just because that perhaps makes the situation a bit less idyllic than people might think if it were actually a village. And I just want to point out generally that I'm sorry I missed the beginning of your lecture, but this is a fairly conservative, even reactionary text. At the end of the play, the passage that's quoted in that novel, when he talks about people who are schwankend gesinnt, by this he means people who sort of sympathize with the French Revolution, and against that, the rest of the passage suggests a sort of national German uh, uh, counterforce against the revolution.
Then may I ask what your background is, please?
Who, mine?
Mhm.
Well, I'm a Germanist, but I've written sort of things from a historical perspective. So
Yes,
So thank you. Thank you very much for this intervention. I think I read the text in the same way, but I know that there are other perspectives, like other readings, that stress a little bit more the aspect. I mentioned this very briefly. The aspect that this is also a story about the preconditions of social change. Yeah, how can Hermann change? How can also the history of his family change? And here you have something like you have a certain openness for the other. Dorothea quotes her late fiancé, yeah, and
yeah.
and he quotes him, and he says something like, before he died, he was a radical Jacobin revolutionist in Paris, but he lost his head eventually. But before that, he said, nun sind wir alle Fremdlinge auf Erden. Yeah, we are all aliens on Earth. And I think this is particularly interesting way to put it, because he implies that the French Revolution has made us all, citizens, or not citizens, but subjects, has made us exiles, like systematically, because he said we are aliens, has made us exiles. And I think the refugees who are exiles, like Dorothea, who came to the east bank of the Rhine, there is this connection with the revolutionaries, like all bonds are loosened. And I think this is like the general Schwanken of the whole world. And I have the tendency to read it as you did, and especially the last lines of the epic poem. They have a weight, a very heavy pre-nationalist way to it. And there's also a research article on like an implicit dimension of the Old Testament, Moses, this whole like dimension of the Jews and the Old Testament that puts the Jews not in a very good position. So there is, it's a problematic text, I think, but I like to think that you can read it from different angles, right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And one of those, I've written about this, that the gender perspectives in the work are really quite interesting, because you have at the end there, you have Hermann, talking about how he's going to defend the homeland, and we're going to defend our wives and children, and yet it was Dorothea who actually did so with a sword, defending girls against marauding French soldiers. So the traditional gender roles are kind of turned upside down in this fight.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
May I intercede just for one moment? I should have asked if the people object to being shown in a recording of this seminar. Is that acceptable to you? Oh, thank you very much. That's important.
I might also mention that I didn't know about these measures that you were talking about that were so restrictive towards immigrants from France. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, most of the immigrants from France who were very, very unpopular in Germany at this time were the nobility who were fleeing from the revolution. I'm not sure if those laws were directed against them or not, but there was a lot of animosity towards them.
Hmm. They were against. I mean, there were some laws that were against the French, like nobility in particular. There were other laws that were especially against the French cleric in Bavaria, for example. There was like a law against the priests from France. But many of the laws don't really make the difference. The French immigrants, like that's the notion. And I think they were targeting not like the minor characters around the nobilities that came, but there's interesting material. I'm working on this at the moment, and there's interesting material in the Geheime Staatsarchiv in Berlin. So there are like petition letters from these aristocrats, like to the Prussian king and to other instances, like petition letters that appeal to the pity, that tell their story and why they have to go. And there's in the public sphere, or it's not the public sphere yet, but you have these reports, public reports of groups of immigrants at the time who are expelled and don't actually know where to go. Like you have early forms of no man's land at the time. But there is some research on it, but not a lot. That makes it so interesting. Yeah.
I mean, when you look at other texts like the Austrian or the Moderator, you can clearly see that there is a pattern in the text, that it has this sort of sympathy for the French nobility and for the aristocrats. And in the lots of texts, it depicts exactly this. That have been expelled. And
I mean,
and when you take into account that he himself was a fun, sexual part of it.
You're referring to the purely.
Yes, absolutely. And that's relationship to him.
Yeah. I mean that's an important point. I think it's not. That's why I try to underline this inner nobility of Dorothea, because I think this is not how do you say Stand, like so class, like this is not a class thing in the way that it's like anti-aristocracy or anti-nobility, I think. But at first glance, the text seems to have more of a nationalist side, not necessarily an anti-nobility side, but a nationalist side. Yeah.
So even nobility were no threat to the existing order. Obviously, they were very much on the right and in favor of maintaining the existing system. I mean, the French nobility, the exiles, I would have thought were more comparable to the Russian aristocracy that left after the Bolshevik Revolution.
I was thinking of that too.
So it was saying there wasn't really a threat of the same thing happening in Germany to Poles. They weren't comparable to any respect.
No, that wasn't what I was saying. That certainly, it was perceived to be a threat. The revolution would spread as it would spread. It might spread.
Because that's what you think.
I mean, as far as I know, and I'm no expert, it's what the ruling elites in various German states. Now they were afraid that there would be Jacobin infection, as it were, claiming, and nobody really can accuse the aristocracy of that. That's what I'm saying, was that it would have been more likely that the aristocracy would have been let in because they were not perceived as Jacobin agitators, and they're ordinary people. So you never knew if they might not be troublemakers. Yes, Madame de Star or something. I'd be likely to rock the political
Are there any other comments, please, or questions? Observations? Is there anything you'd like to add that you perhaps didn't mention but wished you had?
Actually, maybe one thought. I don't know if you agree, but of course, while I was like doing this long bridge into the 20th century, I thought, how would I extend the bridge even more, like to our times or to the last decades? And I thought this question of like examining a refugee, whether he is able to like have this social bond with the host community, that this is today maybe the like this is the economic capability of the refugee. Like, this is often the category that's like is being discussed. Is this refugee economically productive, like, or not? At least like in parts of the discussion in Germany. And so I think that this economic, like the whole thought behind it, the whole mentality, like economic growth, productivity, and so on, this is social bond of like our modern society. And this is like the bond into which you better integrate yourself as a refugee, at least today. So this was like one speculative
Issue that is
There's a whole
the question of identity, loyalty to the host country,
religion.
religion, material contributions. It's a whole, it's a devilish topic, really, and political attitudes, animosity, fear, a threat regarding jobs or change of community. It's so multifaceted and extremely complex, but looked at as a study, extremely interesting, I think. But it's also a social element. Why are the Ukrainians more acceptable as refugees, some of whom may be communist, if not Soviet communist style, rather than someone from Rwanda?
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's a very good question. And it clearly has to do with the concept of Europe. Like there you have a political bond that you don't have from a different region.
Well, even if somebody from the Middle East is a genuine refugee and a Christian, bearing in mind that some Palestinians are Christians, does that make that person any more acceptable in a social or religious context? One could discuss that for a very long time, I think. But perhaps now I may thank you very, very much for this. I think we could talk a long time about the different factors.
Thank you all very much.